Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a new beginning part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story and a 45 word from AO3. So let's start the video. Do I believe that one without a power can become a hero? No, I should think not. A gruff voice said as Izuku looked up. Izuku asked as unknowingly tears fell from his eyes. It's not bad to dream, my boy, but sometimes some dreams are meant to never be attainable. Impossible by some others' views to grab their hands for. I would never forgive myself for sending a quirkless hero to take on a foe who had managed to give me this exceptionally fatal blow. It would be suicide for you and your obvious skills and observation to be placed on the front lines. So no, you cannot become a hero. The gruff voice said before leaving through a door. The boy stared off in the distance. Everything was ringing in his ears as all the events of his day came rolling back at him as he thought about whatever in the hell his life was building up to at this point. He asked the number 1 hero, All Might, if he could become a hero similar to him, and the man just told him that his dreams meant nothing in the face of those who could quite handedly overpower him due to an extra toe joint. Taking a deep breath, the young man glanced over the edge of the building, the words from his old friend / bully coming back up to bite him in the mind as his vision became blurry. Hey, there might be a way for you to become a hero. Pray for a quirk in your next life and jump off the roof. Maybe then you can become a hero. Kaken's voice rang in his head softly. Wiping the tears from his eyes, Izuku walked down the steps leading to the rooftop of the building he was on. Letting out a sad sigh of complete and utter hopelessness, he decided to walk home, completely and utterly unaware of the explosions happening off in the distance from his home. Walking through the streets of Midoriya, he found that the streets were quieter than anything he'd ever seen before and decided to be more cautious about why he was walking home. Moving through the streets as though he were being watched, he finally made it to the street corner near his home, seeing the apartment building in the distance and beginning to rush towards it. He just wanted to lay down on his bed and believe that all today was being a nightmare that had never happened. All Might had always inspired others to become the best they could be. There was no way he could tell one of his biggest fans, albeit unknowingly, that he couldn't become a hero. When he wakes up the next morning, everything will be okay, he will be back to normal, and none of what happened today will even exist. Smack. Oh. Izuku mumbled, as he reached behind his neck and grabbing what hit him in the back of the neck. Pulling whatever it was from the back of his neck, he brought it up in front of his view. All before noticing something odd about how it looked. It was a tranquilizer dart, and he felt his vision slowly blurring again before he struggled to fight against the growing drowsiness. Turning around to see what was going on and who shot him, he found a white van moving in as fast as they could towards his direction and attempted to run away in a growing tenseness and fear. All before he tripped on the very ground he was struggling to walk on and slamming his face into the ground, knocking himself out. The last things he heard were the people who showed up at his nearly unconscious form. Damn, I didn't think he'd resist a tranquilizer dart meant for an elephant. Shut up, we need to get him to base. The voices rang out as he felt a bag being placed on his head. Unknown to everyone, his phone was laying on the ground as he was basically kidnapped. Along with his backpack, as it held the contents of his school day within, as well as a notebook that had burn marks all over it stating hero analysis for my future. 0W0. By the time Izuku woke up again, he found himself in a doctor's office. He didn't know where he was and immediately saw everyone in the room as a threat as he leaped from the table/bed he was on and moving into the corner of the room, hiding under anything he could place before him and those around him. His wary eyes looked around the area of the room, before noticing that there was nobody in the room with him, and those bodies that he'd seen were all in his imagination. His breathing increased heavily as he thought about why he was kidnapped on his way home from school itself. He didn't seem all that important. All those people who experimented on the quirkless were already in prison last he remembered. His breathing levels increased even more as he heard an EKG beeping very loudly as he yanked the things attached to his skin off roughly, leaving a couple of holes and blood seeping through. He glanced at his surroundings, as the EKG had a long beep sound signifying that caused the movement in the hall nearby to quickly head in its direction as Izuku tried his best to find a hiding spot. Eventually he got the bright idea to hide in one of the closets nearby as he took quick gulps of air in complete fear as he heard people rush into the room and look around the place. 𝗬𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏. He was just here a moment ago. How did he escape? A voice called out. I don't care how he escaped. Make sure that he didn't leave the building. Because if he did, he'll be freezing his butt off out there. A feminine voice called out. As the two left the room, Izuku waited for a few moments to calm his raging heart as he took rapid deep breaths. He moved closer to the door as he found it slid open as though it were a futuristic kind of thing to do. Glancing down the halls on both ends, he found that they were empty, and he noticed that his clothing was only that of a hospital patient before moving down the hall. Slowly and cautiously, he moved down the halls trying to wrap his head around why these people needed him of all people and why they had an EKG strapped to his body. Unaware of the blood dripping from his 𝗧𝗓 leading away from the office that he'd just left. For what seemed like hours, Izuku moved through the white walls and windows portraying a very Arctic climate outside. Izuku knew that he wouldn't be heading out there. He didn't even have the clothing for walking out there anyway. He just wanted to get his black 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝑢𝑟𝑎n and just find a way to leave this place. Turning around a corner, he found another seemingly empty hall as he walked down it, following his gut as he tried to navigate around the halls in order to find an escape from this terrifying place. As he was walking down the halls, however, he heard a door a little way behind himself opens up and he looked around for a place to hide. Throwing caution to the wind, he tapped a door module a few times before it opened up in his panic and hid behind it. He heard someone talking in the hall as he placed a hand over his mouth to muffle his heavy breathing before he heard them walk away from the location, although not without them noticing some blood on the ground and leaving to go find someone to clean it up. Once they were gone, Izuku left the room and continued on his path towards a way out of this place that was until he came to a large area that was covered to the brim with tech. The door module definitely had a lot more tech compared to the others as he thought that this might be the way out of here. So as he rose a hand to mess with the module, the door surprisingly enough opened up revealing a young woman with white hair and red eyes. She glanced downward at the boy in front of her as she took in his appearance, his fretful eyes, that were slowly becoming pinpricks as fear bubbled in his heart. That was now rapidly beating. She stared at him for a moment, all before noticing that he was in the medical garb of a patient as she just began to glare at him with nothing more than annoyance. Before she could speak, however, Izuku ran off in the direction to her left in a vain attempt to escape from the scary lady. Because as soon as he reached the end of the hallway, a couple of guards arrived and saw him with a very scared expression on his face as they pulled out their weapons. Weird crystals. They pointed their hands at the boy and stated some words in a weird Latin phrasing as multiple weird blasts rushed towards him. Pulling his arms up to defend himself against the attacks, when not feeling any kind of pain at all, he looked at his arms before noticing how they glowed a light green color with weird pathways on them. He was so confused that he never noticed that a couple more guards came up from behind him with a nightstick striking him in the neck. He immediately fell to the ground unconscious as the woman walked up to them with a very annoyed expression. How in the hell did he escape from the lab? She growled. That's the thing, ma'am. We don't know. All we know is that he somehow vanished. One of the guards called out. I don't care, get Romani over here and tell him to get a better grip on one of our recruits. She growled out before walking back into her office. Once more, Izuku woke up to the smell of disinfectant and a white ceiling. Sitting up immediately, he found himself cuffed to the bed this time as he struggled to escape from the cuffs. That was when the door opened and a young man with light orange-colored hair and teal-colored eyes entered the room with a small notebook on hand. Izuku looked at the man with confusion at first before fear built up in his heart as soon as he noticed how he appeared closer to that of a doctor and hurried his attempts to escape. Hey, don't try and pull yourself out of those. You'll only hurt yourself. The man said, as Izuku glanced at him and every single exit he could find. What is going on? Where am I? And why am I still in this place? Izuku asked, fear writ in his features. Well, young man, if you can calm down I can assure you that I can answer your questions. The man said, placing the small notebook down. I can't do that, I don't know where I am, Izuku said, looking downright ready to just try any kind of attempt to escape. My name is Dr. Romani, and the place you're at right now is called Chaldea. It is the place where we travel through time to stop Holy Grail wars that shouldn't have happened. Dr. Romani introduced himself. Holy Grail W wars. Time travel. W. Izuku questioned, now even more fearful. We found you on the road to your apartment, right? He asked, ignoring Izuku's questions. Why yes, but I was kidnapped, Izuku said as he remembered everything. I apologize about that. The people in charge of this place would rather you come with us rather than inform everyone outside of Chaldea, Dr. Romani said, as Izuku looked at him confusedly. What are you talking about? What's going on? Izuku asked, his heart, which was rapidly beating, slowed. Are you sure you want to know what happened? He asked, concerned. I was kidnapped for an unknown reason and was taken before I was questioned. Do I look like I don't want to know? Izuku said, nearly manic in his expression of fear. Right? Stupid question. Chaldea has been in search of MSDRs for saving the world, Romani said, as Izuku just stared at him with a confused expression. What do you mean by that? Izuku asked, sweat falling down the side of his head. What I mean by that is preventing the incineration of humanity. Because outside of Chaldea all of humanity has been destroyed, Romani said, as Izuku just sat there with a blank expression. The outside W world is gone, Izuku asked, his face paling. All of it. Although for us, it would rather be frozen in time, Romani said, as Izuku stared at him in disbelief. How can I tell if you're not telling me a li right and now? Izuku asked, looking far more cautious. At that, Romani just lifted a data pad and turned on the big screen within the room as Izuku saw the entire world in ruins. He found that Romani was showing him the ruins of his home as it was now covered in vines and foliage. Not only that, but from what it appeared a massive battle took place in the area, and he felt even more tears falling down from his eyes. Looking at Romani, Izuku could only let out a few more words in a questionary manner. Does that mean everyone is dead? Izuku asked, his eyes now pinpricks. I apologize, but yes, he said as he turned off the screen. Romani left the room after that, letting out a massive sigh. He never thought that he'd have to lay it on the kid that his family is all gone. Not only that, but the world he had once known was gone. Izuku laid back down on the cot that was in the room, and which he was cuffed to, as he stared at the ceiling as though there was literally nothing left for him to live for. With Romani, the man made his way back to a big room where some of the MSDRs of Chaldea were waiting. Some had shifted to certain areas in time where they fought their foes in order to prevent the incineration of humanity. He glanced at the woman next to him. She had blue eyes and long brown hair that cascaded down to her lower back. The woman glanced over at him as well, and with a smile she sat down next to him as she took note of his grim expression and spoke to him. Romani, what's wrong? You look as though you've seen death itself again, she said with a little chuckle. I was forced to tell a 14-year-old kid that everything and everyone he knew is gone/dead. And that if we don't stop the incineration of humanity, it will remain that way forever, Romani said, with a deadpan expression. Ouch, that's bad news. How'd he take it? She asked. 𝗵𝗃, I know for a fact that you already know how he's feeling right now, Romani said, whilst rubbing his eyes. Alright, so he's not taking it well. Did you see what his magic circuits were all about? 𝗵𝗃 asked. That I already found out about. Apparently, he's got someone within his lineage who can use magecraft, although there's a problem, Romani said as 𝗵𝗃 looked at him confused. What's wrong? Is it something to do with his bloodline? She asked. No, actually. The problem right now though is his overall mental health, Romani said, as he gave her some files based on Izuku's life. Quirkless diagnosis at the age of 4, and for most of his life bullied relentlessly. That's not too different from some of our newest recruits, she said as Romani placed his head in his hands. I meant his mental health and physical health. From what it appears, his mental issues come from a life surrounded by those who really hated the quirkless. And the same goes for how he looks physically. 𝗵𝗲 said, as 𝗬𝗵𝗃 took a look at the boy's file for his height. He's barely reaching 5 feet, that's not good. She muttered. That's only breaking the surface. His body is littered with scars that a 14-year-old boy shouldn't even have at his age, some of them go back around 5 years 𝗬𝗵𝗃. 𝗵𝗲 vented. 5 years. Forgive me if I'm disbelieving, but that can't be possible. Scars fade after about a couple of years, but if what you're saying is true, that meant that he had to be constantly abused physically for you to be capable of seeing a 5-year-old scar. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 said, I want to know why Olga wants a mentally depressed child, not only that, but one that has absolutely every reason to not want to work with us. 𝗵𝗲 growled as he slammed his fist onto the table. Am I allowed to speak? A meek voice called out behind them. Mesh, what's up? 𝗵𝗲 asked, curiously hiding all anger and fury. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 has found the newest recruit and won't leave his hair, she said, as she pulled up a data pad with a camera pointed at Izuku and 𝗧𝗲. Izuku was just laying in the room looking completely dead inside, whilst 𝗧𝗲 just was enjoying laying near the boy's head of green hair, even trying to eat some of it for and giggles. I swear, I will never know if that thing is more feline or canine. 𝗵𝗲 grumbled under his breath as he stood up and left. Izuku sat in the office as he felt himself slowly regaining some semblance of calm over his mind. The simple fact that he'd been thinking so fast about everything that had happened in the past few hours, as well as those that had happened before he arrived at this weird place. The silence of the medical bay was enough to bring him to think about the whole day he'd gotten after he had the worst day of his life so far, and from how he felt in the moment he supposed that being kidnapped was par for the course. Of all the things to happen to him specifically, he thought that getting attacked by a villain, only to be saved by All Might himself, and then being told that he couldn't become a hero by the very same man, all before being kidnapped by a group of men in a white van and brought to a place he had no idea where he was. Yeah, one could say that today was the worst day of his life. Sighing in exasperation about why this was all happening to him specifically, Izuku felt something nudge him on the hip. Looking down, he found a small creature that looked similar to both a canine and feline in appearance alone, but felt as though it should have been something else, something far more dangerous than them. Taking a deep breath, he helped the small creature climb up him and he held it in his arms, all before it decided that hanging limply in Izuku's arms were not something that it wanted and took refuge in his hair. After a bit of struggle, of course. But Izuku didn't find it within his heart to care about that fact at this point in time. What was really on his mind at the moment was, well, how he was going to go on from here. His idol in everything heroics had basically told him to give up on his dreams of becoming a hero. And he was kidnapped by a group of people who were actually trying to save the world. At least that was what he got from the doctor that he could understand. He raised a hand and scratched the creature on his head, using it as a makeshift nest under its chin as it purred softly as he thought about his next idea for what to do here. Never before had someone grabbed him for a purpose, and he felt as though he'd be holding everyone back from their full potential if he stayed here. Although he preferred to just sit there and think, it wasn't until a few minutes later that a young woman entered the room looking for something. 𝗧𝗲, what are you doing here? A feminine voice asked, before looking at Izuku. I think he wanted to sleep in my hair. Izuku said with a shy wave. I'm so sorry about him. He's never done something like this before. The girl said as she rushed over to him, attempting to get 𝗧𝗲 off his head. So his name is 𝗧𝗲? Izuku asked as his face became red from how close the girl was. Yeah, he suddenly appeared one day. And ever since he'd been by my side and helped me through some harsh times. The girl said with a small smile on her face. I can see that. Izuku said, reaching up and grabbing 𝗧𝗲 and pulling them from his hair. It let out a whine of disapproval as Izuku just scratched it under its chin. All before giving 𝗧𝗲 off to the girl as she grabbed the small creature softly, although when their hands touched slightly, a brief flash of a memory so fast that neither could recognize it for a moment moved through their eyes. Shaking their heads at that, the two just apologized to one another before Dr. 𝗵𝗲 entered the room to see 𝗧𝗲 trying to climb out of the girl's arms and onto Izuku's head. The man sighed in exasperation before walking over to Izuku and asking the girl to leave, giving her name as Mash. For the next few hours Izuku was pushed through multiple tests to see if he was healthy and was let out once it was declared that he was. Although Dr. Romani wondered why Izuku was as short as he was, he never mentioned it as the young man just left the room in the clothes he was given. Of course, he was confused at the type of clothing he was given since it was slightly bigger on his relatively short and scrawny frame as it nearly slipped off his shoulders. He walked around the place to get a good look at it in order to see what his job around the place would be. Although he wished he could be more useful to them, he just kept to himself. From what it appeared, everyone was becoming tenser as time passed. Izuku didn't know if that was coming from his presence, but he just moved around as he explored it without the fact of guards coming after him and him being in a much calmer mindset. He arrived at a room where a group of people were standing in and watched from afar as a woman with white hair had been speaking to them all with a very serious expression before her eyes fell upon him, their newest recruit. She smirked somewhat maliciously before walking over to him, causing him to freeze as though he were prey in the eyes of a predator. Grabbing his shoulder with a palm, he winced slightly from the burn that was aggravated as she dragged him into the room. "All right, everyone, this is the newest recruit that 𝗧𝗪 has managed to grab. His magic circuits have been giving us trouble finding them, but I hope you all treat him as though he were one of your own. Also make sure he's all caught up on what the plans are as a future 𝗵𝗃," the woman said, before leaving Izuku in the room. The room fell silent as soon as the woman left, and Izuku was looking even more scared and very uncomfortable until a young man walked up. He had long blonde hair and blue eyes, but his face showed an expression that was more serious than most of the others in the room as he stared down at the timid boy. Reaching a hand out in an act of pure curiosity, he began to speak to Izuku. "Hello there, my name is 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 𝗧𝗵, and I am the leader of the group of MSDRs who are within cryptors. I hope you are ready for your job as a future MSTR of 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏," the man said with a small bow. "A future MSTR? What does that mean exactly? And what is happening right now?" Izuku asked, looking around the room as the other MSDR's candidates had left the room. "You're not aware of what we at 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 do here?" the young man 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 asked. "And no, I was just taken from the street. I was on my way home from school," Izuku said as the man nodded. "Of course, as punctual as always. They really should be out there asking people to join rather than kidnap them," 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 muttered before coughing slightly. "Anyway, what your job as a future MSR within 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 is to eventually become powerful in magecraft and summon your own servant," 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 informed as Izuku thought about it. "How am I supposed to do that?" Izuku asked as the man let him follow him out. "We use our Shielder class demi-servant MadCrona in order to produce the item that is used for summoning. It can summon heroic spirits from a time that they had originally existed and pull them out so that we can receive help for stopping the end of humanity," 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 explained as Izuku somehow produced a notebook and wrote this down. So what is the catalyst for such a summon?" Izuku asked as the man looked at him from the corner of his eye. "Well, we use Mash's shield in order to act as a catalyst. It can summon any servant within the past up till this time period, although I wish it was as predictable as it used to be," the man said with a sigh. As the two arrived at a massive room, they entered it and found multiple pods as a giant ball of flames coagulating in a circular motion was seen far below them through a glass floor. Izuku watched on in horror as he felt as though the glass would break, which caused him to walk silently around the place as 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 watched with nothing more than a glance as he continued to talk about what 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 stands for. He spoke of how everything outside of 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 at this point in time is in danger of being incinerated due to an enemy who they are fighting. There wasn't much information that they could find on the person responsible. But 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 needed every single MSTR as possible in order to fight this new threat. Izuku watched on in awe as multiple MSDRs had come and gone through the doors of the area 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 had shown him. The multiple pods gave him a very bad feeling about them since he'd lived in a society surrounded by less technology and more akin to tech centered around quirks. It was enough that Izuku looked at 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 with a very concerned and worried expression as he tugged on the man's white jacket that seemed to just hang from his shoulders. He looked down at Izuku with eyes that were seemingly emotionless, but they showed a kindness he'd never seen from others before. "Did you know about the society I came from?" Izuku asked with a low voice. "Yes, I do. And personally, I think that having a quirk to be a hero is absurd. The term of hero has lost its meaning ever since quirks had come into play. But that's my personal opinion and you are entitled to your own. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗧 watched as Izuku's expression had multiple changes through emotions. The first was surprise, then it was guilt, moving on to disbelief, all before settling on acceptance. He'd never seen such emotions displayed on another MSDR's face in such a speed. He'd seen from Izuku that he was immediately worried about the boy's health, both physical and mental. He then spoke. I take it your experience with that kind of society wasn't very good. He questioned, although it was more like a statement. And not really. I wasn't treated as a normal human. But I'm pretty sure how I was treated was similar to others. Izuku said, his expression unsure of his own words. Well, I guess we should stop talking about that subject. It clearly hurts you too much to talk about. Anyway, the ray shift for the MSDRs and MASH will begin within the next couple of days. And I hope that you'll be ready by that time frame. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗧 said, before preparing to leave. What will I be doing? Izuku asked, confused. Oh, you'll be a part of my team. Learning the ropes from me. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗧 said with a small smile on his face. 0W0? Izuku was very confused the next day that he woke up within Chaldea. He had met 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗧 the previous day and was deeply confused as to what he was supposed to do in preparation in how to become an STR. He wasn't exactly given any instructions on what to do for that department, and he was given merely 48 hours before he had to be ready for anything and everything that could happen in that time frame. As he moved through the room that had been shown to him by Dr. Romani the previous night, the boy had been very leery of almost everything in Chaldea. That Dr. Romani was the only person Izuku allowed near himself. He found some books on the shelf nearby. He picked them up and saw that they were all notebooks, something that he felt his heart melt at. They at least thought about everything he'd loved in the past, about writing about heroes and villains he'd come across in his travels in Japan. He prepared to write down on it before realizing something. What in the world was he supposed to write inside of it? Well, since I'm writing in a notebook, I guess I can call this my diary. Gosh, it feels wrong calling it that, so I will be calling this my journal about life in Chaldea. From what it appears though, I am not allowed to leave the place and everyone expects me to know about how to be a MSTR by tomorrow morning. And personally, I have no idea what a MSTR is. All that I've been told by people, well, the only ones who I've managed to talk to me without my heart completely acting as though I'm running a marathon, is that 𝗵𝗃 is someone who controls a servant that they summon. How this is possible I still don't know, because that requires you to at least revive those servants from the dead if they really are what they call them. These heroic spirits. But if there was any kind of heroic spirit that I certainly hope to recruit to my cause, it has to be someone who actually wishes to protect humanity. Based on what everyone tells me, humanity is incinerated once we enter Chaldea, which greatly confuses me. I was just out there 2 days ago, having the worst day of my life so far, when I was kidnapped right off the street. So I have no idea what is right or wrong at this point in time. Izuku stopped writing as he stared at the paper, before closing the notebook and leaving the book itself on the desk. Taking a deep breath to try and calm his heart that had increased during his writing, he looked over to the door as he felt as though he really doesn't belong in a place like this. He'd been told time and time again that he didn't belong in this existence, much less alive for others to see it, and to see how these people said that they need him, it was making him very concerned. Mainly because of the fact that nobody wanted something from him unless he had something to give, and he was very worried about what they really wanted from him aside from him becoming a 𝗵𝗃 of Chaldea. As the boy continued to fall into despair within the confines of both his room and his mental battle, the door to his room had opened up. In strutted in the creature that he'd met the previous day. As it looked around the place, finding Izuku sitting on the ground in a corner of it, his eyes being the only thing that were glowing to represent his presence. Strutting over to the clearly panicking boy, it climbed onto his head and laid down purring, causing Izuku to fall out of his mental panic attack. Looking up, he found a face looking down at him with a worried expression, if an animal like foe could give one, as it tilted its head in front of his face. Picking up the animal and placing it on his lap, Izuku calmly rubbed the creature's back as he took deep intakes of air. He shook his head as the memories of his last couple days before arriving here passed through his mind, how he was ruthlessly beaten every day, how he was told that his existence would be better off non-existent. His confidence in what he could do was already below the mark where it should be, far below it in fact if he were to make a bar. But based on his experience in Chaldea, now that he thought about it, the only person who treated him like somewhat of an equal was 𝗧𝗓𝗄, as the man had made sure to welcome Izuku warmly into their fold. Now though, the only thing on his mind was how to activate these magical circuits that the white-haired young woman talked about earlier yesterday. He looked at Foe, who was looking as though he were attempting to escape from Izuku's nervous, petting let the little animal go as it rushed off to find the person he belonged to. Shaking his head in exasperation, Izuku stood up and got his uniform on as he left the room itself and entered the hallway leading over to the simulator for MSDRs to take whenever they feel like it. As he walked through the halls, he found himself at the area where most of the other were taking their tests in the simulator. Entering the room, he found 𝗧𝗓𝗄 looking around the place, as though he were looking for someone, and as he walked over the man looked at him and felt relieved. "Hey little guy, I'm sorry for not waking you up earlier. We come here to learn more about how to be a MSDR, but if there's anything you need to know about these simulators, it's that anything that happens within it doesn't come out of it on the outside," 𝗧𝗓𝗄 stated, as Izuku nodded. "Any questions?" he asked. What is 𝗧𝗵𝗲 supposed to do?" Izuku asked, cursing himself mentally for stuttering. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is someone who summons a servant for a Holy Grail war. But for Chaldea, they are someone who summons a servant to assist them in a singularity. Currently I'm waiting for the first ever ray shift in order to begin taking on the singularities. But within these singularities you can meet up with servants from previous Holy Grail wars and can make them your servants until you manage to escape from it, 𝗧𝗓𝗄 informed. "Okay, I can get the general idea, but what happens at the end of a Grail war?" Izuku asked, curious. "Well, at the end the Holy Grail is given to the winner, albeit with the death of the final servant of the war itself in order to grant any wish you might have," 𝗧𝗓𝗄 said, as Izuku thought about it more. Last question 𝗧𝗓𝗄-san, what happens to those who don't have a wish? Izuku asked, as the young man gave him a concerned expression. "Did you not have a wish if you were to be brought into a Holy Grail war?" he asked, as Izuku shook his head. The only thing I willingly wish for was either a quirk or a friend," Izuku said, as 𝗧𝗓𝗄 just stared at him. "If you weren't being selfish with such a wish, what would you specifically wish for?" he asked, concerned. "Well, I wouldn't specifically have a wish. I'd rather give the wish to someone else," Izuku said, causing the man to stare at him in awe. Wow, Japan really is missing out on a potential hero student. Anyway, just place this device over your head and you can begin the simulations, 𝗧𝗓𝗄 said, as Izuku followed his instructions. The boy was into different places around the simulations, and he was feeling completely confused by all kinds of information coming at him from all angles. They talked about how 𝗧𝗓𝗄 should act when around a servant they summon, not only that how the servant was to be treated as nothing more than an enforcer of an army. This was something Izuku greatly disagreed with. Summoning a heroic spirit even if they were technically dead already, didn't sound right to treat them as nothing more than an actual servant for the rich. So when the question came to how he'd act around a servant, he specifically stated that he'd treat them as he would if they were alive. He'd treat them with kindness and then ask them for their autographs since they were very powerful and famous figures in the past, not to mention really recognizable people based on history itself. Once the whole simulation training as MSDR was over, Izuku stumbled out of the room to find that he had been in there for what appeared to be hours, as the entire day had come and gone in an instant. Something he hadn't been prepared for since he didn't expect to have been in that simulation for over 10 hours. Once he arrived within his bedroom at around midnight, he had laid down on his bed. He was about to close his eyes, when he saw a weird set of eyes glaring down at him from the ceiling of the room itself, and getting up from the bed and walking to the light SW, he turned it on to reveal nothing was there. Shaking his head from the sheer suddenness of his mind slowly failing, he laid down on the bed after turning off the light and fell asleep almost as fast as all might were to say "I am here." As he slept, the figure who had hidden himself from Izuku's eyes had immediately fell to the ground before leaving, their closed eyes and fur collar having fluttered in the wind coming into the boy's room as the man chuckled to himself before heading down the hall. As for the sleeping boy, however, his dreams were filled with nothing more than fire and death. Izuku's dreams were filled with fire, not only that but the air was covered with a reddish-black smog that covered the sky. The city was burning, and as he looked around the area to see what in the hell was happening, he saw a figure stand out in the distance with a sickening smile on their face. It was so horrid and not what he expected of hero society that when the man revealed himself to him, Izuku was almost sick to his stomach as he stared at the very familiar face he'd once seen as a child. A face who had no freckles but covered instead with scarring all around the area where his eyes were supposed to be. His smile was a very sick rendition of All Might's as he held his dimples up so that he could keep the smile on his face. His suit was torn all over the place, and Izuku found himself knelt before the man. Man was smirking at him with all the malicious intent he could ever sense from him as he walked over to Izuku's kneeling form. The man stared down at Izuku with all the hatred a man, no monster could ever hold towards humanity as he spoke to Izuku in the dream almost as though Izuku was inside the man's mind. "Hello there, little one. Now where did you go? I thought you were supposed to stay near your mother," the man asked, as Izuku felt his entire form tremble in his presence. Izuku remained silent as the man chuckled again. "Well, if you don't wish to speak to me, then I will continue to speak to you. If you merely wish that saving humanity will stop me from destroying society as you know it, you are sorely mistaken. All I need to do is connect with your consciousness and I can find you," the man said, before his smile became mad. "Now though, I personally think that you should go back to that building. They need your assistance, little hero," the man said, before the fire and flames overtook the man. "Ea-wea." Izuku screamed as he fell out of his bed. Falling off the cot that was given to him, Izuku placed a hand over his ear. His breathing was all over the place. His breathing went from normal pace to a very rapid and small intakes as he trembled all over himself. His breathing shuddering as he tried to make sense of whatever that dream was, and what that meant for him if that man was going to come to Chaldea. But if there was any consolation, he knew that the man wouldn't ever find Chaldea considering the fact that he was all the way back in Japan. How Izuku knew this he wouldn't ever know, but he felt it was true. Once he left the bedroom, his eyes had bags under them as he walked through the building. His uniform was on, and it looked as though he did it without much thought considering it was very loose on his body as he walked through the halls. His eyes were fluttering as he shook his head, before he collapsed onto the ground and passed out from lack of sleep. And it would remain that way until it was time for the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 project to begin and see if anyone can do anything to help history stay the same and prevent the incineration of humanity. He felt something his face, and as he slowly woke up, he found Mash standing in front of him. But for some reason all his memories of the young woman in front of him, especially her name, had been lost to him as he slowly sat upright, bags still under his eyes as the girl fretted over him. "Senpai, are you all right?" the girl asked. "Am I dreaming?" Izuku asked as the girl tilted her head at him. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Because I'm seeing an angel right now," Izuku said, bluntly without a stutter. Blushing Mash just shook her head as she helped him stand upright once more. "No, I'm not an angel. But did you forget my name?" she asked, concerned. "I couldn't remember anything for a moment there. Why, your name is Imesh, right?" Izuku asked as the girl nodded. "Are you doing okay, senpai?" she asked, concern in her tone. I should be. But what is going on right now?" Izuku asked, feeling even more tired than before. "The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 project is about to begin. We're going to be ray-shifting into the Fuyuki singularity," Mash informed as Izuku followed her towards the ray-shifting room. 0W0. Izuku and Mash arrived at the ray-shifting room as Foe jumped from Mash's shoulder and left the room. By the time they reached the room, Izuku was told to stay inside of the main room where the people watching the ray-shifting project take place. So as he bade his farewell to Mash, he entered the room to find the white-haired woman staring at him with a very angered expression as Izuku leant backwards to keep her face as far away from his own as possible. "Do you know how long we've been waiting for you? Come on, you need to be prepared for this," the woman said, as Izuku nodded slightly out of fear. "Commence the 𝗧𝗵𝗃," the woman said as the few other people in the room nodded. "Commencing the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 program." beginning with Group AD. Then finally with the cryptors, all signs are showing that everything is a-okay. Romani said from his side. As the room began to glow a blue light, Izuku felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It always happened whenever something bad was going to happen, and as soon as that feeling arrived the entire room was bathed in a massive explosion as Izuku was blasted out of the room itself. As soon as that had happened, the boy's vision had failed him for all but a few minutes and he fell into a small nap through hitting his head on the wall behind himself. He woke up again to the distinct sounds of foe chirping in his ear trying to wake him up, and as he roused from his slumber, Izuku noticed how much smoke was in the air. Placing the collar of his uniform over his mouth, he coughed slightly before rushing into the ray-shifting room to see if there were any survivors. As he ran through the room, he saw way too many bodies lying on the ground, either with most of their bodies burnt beyond repair, or they had been bleeding out on the ground with no way to save them from death. Izuku searched for someone to help and save from the fires and flames when he heard the sound of Masha's voice grunting in pain. Running over to where he heard her voice, he found a massive pillar that had once been inside the wall on the left-hand side of the room on her legs. His pupils shrunk in size as he rushed over to her with foe on his shoulder as he placed his hands under the pillar and lifted as much as he could. "Senpai, why you need to get out of here?" Mash said, blood flowing from below in her mouth. "I won't leave you behind, Mash," Izuku yelled, as he yanked on the pillar as strong as he could. "Senpai, why you need to worry about yourself?" Mash tried to say, before Izuku looked into her eyes. "Mash, I need you to at least try and push up. I can't save you if you won't try," Izuku said, looking into her eyes. She looked back into his emerald eyes as she looked at his downright fearful gaze, all before she tried her best to lift the pillar as well. As Izuku pulled up with all of his scrawny might, he watched as the pillar seemed to move upright a bit as Mash attempted to move forward. All before the pillar fell back onto her back and rear, as she let out a pained yelp as Izuku did his best to try and at least save her more. He ran over and grabbed some metal in order to try and lever the pillar up and allow Mash some space to escape, but it was no use. "Senpai, just let me go save why yourself," Mash begged as Izuku shook his head. "I can't leave why you like this," Izuku said as the fires got closer to them. Unaware of what was happening beneath them both, the blue light was beginning to cover Izuku and Mash. "See, can you stay with me then? F for WH when I go?" Mash asked, looking into his eyes. "Why yeah, but you won't die," Izuku said, tears flowing from his eyes. As the two stared into one another's eyes, Izuku felt a burning sensation on his right hand before the room became enveloped in a blue glow. And within seconds, the two who were standing within the ray-shifting room had disappeared from existence, as the pillar fell through the floor after the two disappeared from the room itself. 0W0, Izuku felt himself falling through the air. As he fell, he found himself closing in towards the ground at a rapid pace. Flailing his arms about in a way to try and slow down his fall, something rammed right into his stomach, causing him to cough out spittle and pushing all the air out of his lungs as the wind flew past him. And with a small cloud of dust, he hit the ground with something on top of him as he groaned in pain before he tried to sit up only to find that something, or rather, someone was laying on top of him. He felt something soft over his lower body as he blushed crimson before looking at who was laying on top of him. Mash was shown to be laying on top of him, whilst holding a massive shield in her other hand that laid right next to his body. She woke up from her slumber as she looked at Izuku's massively blushing face as she sat upright, accidentally smacking him in the head as the two held onto their heads in unison. That was until they heard a scream coming from down the road, knocking the two out of their pain, and the two nodded at one another, holding back the panic that was what in the world was happening. Running down the road, they found a somewhat comedic scene of the director of Chaldea running back and forth down a couple streets with a small smoke cloud coming up behind them. Sweat dropping at what they were seeing, Izuku gave a glance at Mash as the girl rose her shield up in front of them both. That was when the director ran over to him and hid behind the shield, asking for the two of them to protect her from any and all harm, and not taking those words for granted, Izuku ordered Mash to take care of the enemies. With Mash fighting off the enemies, Izuku glanced back over at the director as she looked as though she was scared. So he knelt to be at her height as the woman was on the ground sitting on her knees looking at 𝗵𝘃 fight with fear written in her expression. "Why, you're the director of 𝗧𝗵𝗲, right?" Izuku asked, bringing the woman's attention over to him. "Yes. What in the hell are you doing here though?" the director asked, slightly angered. "I went to try and help some of the survivors, but I only found 𝗵𝘃. Then the room became covered in a blue glow, and we showed up here," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his head. Of course I have to be here with the one person who has no idea what they're doing," the director said, as Izuku frowned a bit. "I may not know what I'm doing, but 𝗵𝘃 appears to be having fun out there," Izuku said, pointing at 𝗵𝘃 who was smashing the skeletal warriors with ease with a happy expression on her face. The director just stared at the scene before her with nothing more than a blank face before looking at Izuku, who appeared to be more confident at the moment. That was until she spoke again. "Okay, so what if 𝗵𝘃 is taking care of the enemies? What are you going to do when you are all alone without her presence?" the director questioned. I don't know, you should have known that I'm not as suited for this. I'm just pushing the fear I have down at the moment," Izuku said, before focusing on how 𝗵𝘃 was on her way back. Once she got back, the trio had decided to make their way through the burning city and black smog covering the sky. They looked around for a ley line in order to make a small base of operations to prevent the singularity from becoming far worse than it was supposed to be. And all throughout the entire city, the trio fought for their lives, taking on skeletal warriors as well as being trailed by shadow servants. They were able to lose 2 of the 3, but the 4th was there and chasing after them, or more specifically Izuku, as the young man was seriously considering why he was even brought here. The shadow servant had swung a short blade towards Izuku as the young man dodged just by a hair. 𝗵𝘃 then went into the defense as she blocked the first attack before the shadow servant had kicked her shield, knocking the 2 back as they bounced across the ground before stopping at a wall. The shadow servant then began to create small portals to send swords of many types towards the 2 before something landed in front of the 2 with a giant tree blocking the attack. Looking up, they found a man with blue hair in a braid as his clothes indicated that he was from the northern peninsula of Britannia. He looked over his shoulder and gave the 2 a knowing smirk before she spoke. "Hello there, kids. Need a hand?" he asked. The blue-haired man stood in front of them, a magical barrier protecting them from the broken noble phantasm. He stood firm as he held his wooden staff in the air as he projected a weird-looking rune to protect them all from the attack of the shadow archer. He grunted with effort as the 2 just stared at him in awe. That was before he spoke out loud for the 2 of them to hear him, catching them both off guard. "Hey, I know that I'm pretty and everything, but I'm kinda in the mood to just retreat right about now," the man called out. "Sorry. What do you need help with?" Izuku called out with some slight fear in his tone. "What I need right about now is someone with enough magical energy to keep me in this world. Think one of you can do that?" the man asked, as Izuku looked at 𝗵𝘃 with an uncertain expression. "You won't be trying to kill us if we accept you into our group, right?" 𝗵𝘃 asked, concerned. "What? Who do you guys take me for, the devil?" the man asked, as he grunted with effort to hold back the broken phantasm. "Well, this is my first time as a emissary of 𝗧𝗵𝗲, Izuku said, as the blue-haired man gave him an exasperated expression. "You know what? If we manage to survive this mess, I will be giving you both a rundown of what a Holy Grail war is and making sure that it stays in your mind for future adventures," the man said, before pushing as much power into the barrier as possible. "Okay, let's just focus on getting out of here then," 𝗵𝘃 called out, as Izuku prepared to grab Olga. They both turned around to grab Olga, only to find the outline of where Olga was supposed to be, as the woman was already hightailing it out of there. She was even leaving behind a comedic smoke trail to let them know which direction she ran off to. Looking at one another, Izuku and 𝗵𝘃 had rushed off, allowing the caster servant to drop his barrier and rush after them both in an attempt to escape the shadow archer servant. And from what it appeared, they had managed to escape through the cover of the smoke cloud from the explosion coming from Archer's attack. For a few minutes the trio had rushed down the road, only to find Olga having defeated her own set of skeletal warriors. She was heavily, but as she looked at the trio she ran over to them and just slapped the backsides of their head in her fury of having to fight all on her own. This was where the blue-haired magician had decided to interject into the argument and be on the side of Izuku, who had quite literally done nothing wrong to begin with. Hey, just because he wasn't there to protect you that time doesn't mean he won't be in the future, the man said as Olga moved her eyes to him. And you, who in the hell are you? She called out, as the young man just stared at her with a confused expression. Should I tell her my name, or should I let the kid who looks like he's about to have a brain aneurysm from the look he's giving her? The man asked, as Mash looked over at Izuku. The boy was staring at Olga with what appeared to be an appalled expression on his face. Olga looked over briefly and found that the boy was indeed giving her that expression of complete bewilderment as well as shock written on his features. All before he began to speak to the woman. Director-san, how can you not know who he is? He's extremely famous in the legend of 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏. Izuku called out, as the woman gained a confused expression. How do you know who he is then? She asked, looking at him. Before you all kidnapped me from my way home, I had a lot of time to study on heroes before the age of quirks. Izuku spoke without a stutter. I told them not to kidnap anyone. It's not my fault that you have a very good set of magic circuits. Olga called out indignantly. Senpai, can you tell us who Heichi is? Mash asked, a little bit wary of his sudden awe. Of course. He's the famed student of 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, the one who once held the powerful spear, 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏. Izuku said, with a very odd and happy expression on his face. What is his name though? Olga questioned. He's 𝗬𝗪𝗓𝗏, the famed spearman who was named the Child of Light from Ireland. Not only that, but his mother was immortal whilst his father was their god of the sun, Izuku said, excitedly. 𝗬𝗪 just stared at the boy list off a few things from his life and couldn't help but chuckle. All before he watched the boy ruffle around with his uniform for a second, before quite literally summoning a notebook from right out of his butt. It was scuffed, but at the same time waterlogged. It was concerning because of the burn marks all over it as the boy held it out to him with a pen and a starry-eyed expression taking over his entire mood. Can you sign this? The boy asked, excited. Well, I don't see why not. But I don't have 𝗬𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏 with me. If I had it with me, this would have been far easier for me to deal with. The man said with a sigh. So, with the robes and the staff, that means you're a caster servant, right? Mash asked. Yup, and it was just my luck to be summoned as a servant in the caster class. My MST taught me everything she knew about the Nordic runes she had learnt in her entire life, but I wasn't really paying much attention to that at the time. I was more focused on learning how to be the best spearman in the entirety of Ireland. 𝗬𝗪 said with a chuckle before handing Izuku his notebook back. Izuku stared at the man's name as he soon looked at the previous page of the notebook itself. 𝗬𝗪, Mash and Olga watched as his excited demeanor had suddenly disappeared and was replaced with a very sad expression. One that he had immediately changed to that of a neutral expression as he placed his notebook away behind the shirt of his uniform for Chaldea. Olga and Mash gave each other a glance of acknowledgement before looking at Izuku with a worried expression. That was before 𝗬𝗪 entered the conversation once again. Anyway, so as thanks for saving your lives, think you can make me your servant, so I don't disappear from the world? 𝗬𝗪 asked, as Izuku moved over and held a hand out. Sure thing. I hope I have enough magical and energy to supply your stay here. Izuku said, as 𝗬𝗪 shook his hand. The two felt the connection of Izuku's energy into 𝗬𝗪_𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀's whole connection into this world. He chuckled a bit before looking at the girls with an expression that was odd for even himself to have in this kind of singularity. So, what do you think the plan will be now that we've been contracted to work together? 𝗬𝗪 asked as Izuku sat down and thought about it. Well, we could always try and find the Holy Grail. It was why we came here in the first place. But then again, we'd be looking all over the place for it, and that could take literal days before we can even find it. But that remains to ask the question of where it even is in the first place. Izuku muttered, as he rubbed his chin with his index finger. The others just watched the boy mutter to himself as 𝗬𝗪 just had a smile on his face. He glanced at the two women who were standing near him and gave them a wink before speaking aloud to the two of them whilst allowing Izuku his time to think about a plan. Now that the boy is sufficiently distracted from us, we need to talk about what we just saw him do, 𝗬𝗪 said, expression grim. Yeah, what kind of emotional change was that? He went from happy to sad so fast it was strong to tell if he was faking it. Olga mumbled. See, could it have to do with what he was doing before he arrived at Chaldea, director? Mash asked as Olga thought about it. It couldn't be that. He was on his way home from school based on what my men told me. Olga said as Mash thought about it a bit more. How about this? What if your men only found him when he appeared to be walking home? How did he react to arriving at Chaldea in the first place? 𝗬𝗑 asked. He was rightfully skittish as well as very scared. He walked out of the infirmary and tried to find an exit as soon as he woke up. Mash said as 𝗬𝗑 nodded. Now what kind of society did he live in before you all basically kidnapped him from his way home again? 𝗬𝗑 questioned a bit further. The man was going to only let them figure it out on their own. Just from connecting to the boy's hand he had a very brief flash of the boy's worst moment. And needless to say, he was already hopping to use some runes on a certain Pomeranian mad dog of a human being whose name started with AK and ended with an O. As the two girls were thinking about it, they weren't really drawing a connection with the question at hand until 𝗬𝗑 looked over at Izuku as they saw him still muttering to himself. Mash then remembered what 𝗵𝗃 stated before they set up the ray-shifting program that morning. Mash, I don't know what he's told you. But Midoriya just won't talk about his life before coming here. Yeah, he's only been here for only about 56 hours, but there is something clearly wrong with him. He's got scars on his body that lasted all the way until he was only around 6 years old. A child at that age shouldn't even have scars like that. 𝗵𝗃's words rang in her mind. Wait, Olga, what are the statistics of those who are born quirkless? Mash suddenly asked. What are you talking about? Aren't there no statistics for them at all? Olga questioned. Please just try and find out about it. Mash urgently stated. The woman pulled out her phone as Dr. 𝗵𝗃 actually entered the conversation. Apparently, they were on a ley line of magic so they could connect with him. You need some information about the Holy Grail. 𝗵𝗃's voice rang out, which coincidentally caught Izuku out of his muttering spree. Dr. 𝗵𝗃, I didn't know you could contact us right now. Izuku said as the man chuckled. Don't worry, Izuku, you all are on a ley line of magical energy. It allowed me to connect to your tools that allow me to talk to you all. In terms of where you all need to go, you need to head over to Mt. Enzo. I'm getting a massive energy reading from there. It might be where the Holy Grail that you need to collect is located currently. But there is another problem. Dr. 𝗵𝗃 said, as Izuku sighed in exasperation. When will there be good news? Izuku asked as he placed his hands over his face. You haven't even been with us too long to even ask that, kid, but anyway there's a servant there and they are extremely powerful. So be on the lookout. Dr. 𝗵𝗃 said, as Izuku gave the man a small salute. Hey kid, come with me a second, I'd like to know more about the future where you're from. 𝗬𝗑 said, pulling Izuku away from the two girls and 𝗵𝗃. Okay, but let's not stray too far. Izuku said, a bit warily. Don't worry about it, kid, just loosen up a bit. We've got a little while before the fight begins. 𝗬𝗑 said, brushing off Izuku's worry. With that said and done, 𝗬𝗑 looked over his shoulders and gave the girls a wink to allow them to speak with 𝗵𝗃. And as the two boys walked away but not too far away to where they wouldn't hear them call for help should they require it, 𝗵𝗃 spoke up to the two of them. Is there something else you wanted to know? 𝗵𝗃 asked. Yes. Can you do a checkup on the quirkless statistics of the outside world from Chaldea? Olga asked, concerned. I can, but it might take a few minutes. Or probably none at all. Jesus, this is just horrible. 𝗵𝗃 said as he held a small tablet in his hand through the hologram. What's wrong, 𝗵𝗃? Mash asked, worried. It's just that there's no information from the Japanese about the quirkless. But when compared to the other countries of the world, their statistics state that everything is fine with the quirkless, but after having 𝗵𝗃 dig a bit from her end you're not going to like what I'm seeing right now. 𝗵𝗃 said with a grimace. What's wrong? Olga asked. There's hundreds, if not thousands of articles talking about those who are quirkless being hunted down and killed. Not to mention that those who support quirk supremacy laws are trying to ban quirkless humans from even existing in the world at all, even going as far as to make their lives a living hell. 𝗵𝗃 said with a slight gulp. Is there anything else you can find, 𝗵𝗃? Olga asked, now looking over at Izuku as the young man was talking to the older hero about the heroes of his time. Yeah, but it's not good, 𝗵𝗃 said, wincing. Well, to get on with it. Olga growled out. But, Jesus. I found some statistics from an underground hero in Japan. Goes by the name of Eraserhead. I'm not sure why he named himself that, probably to hide his real identity, but from what he's written down in an article he's witnessed hundreds of kids without quirks kill themselves before they even reach the age of 10. And how old is Izuku right now? 𝗵𝗃 questioned as Olga thought about it. He doesn't even look more than the age of 12. Olga said as 𝗵𝗃 shook his head. Isn't he around 13? Mash asked as 𝗵𝗃 nodded. His height was stunted due to his surroundings and inability to eat a whole lot. I've hacked into the school he went to, and their cameras aren't very good with their firewalls, and his school life was pretty much non-existent. If you forego the whole bullying and suicide baiting he got just 2 days ago. 𝗬𝗏𝗍's voice said, from the hologram. Wait, when we took him in he was suicide baited. Olga yelled, unaware that it caught the attention of Izuku and 𝗬𝗏, who looked at them in confusion. Izuku looked ready to head back over there and see what the girls were talking about, but they were interrupted by the incoming sound of marching, and turning to look at what was incoming, they found hundreds of skeletal warriors walking towards them with expressionless eyes and faces, and a shadow servant following not far behind them. Izuku sent 𝗬𝗏 out to fight the skeletal warriors and the shadow servant. He wasn't sure who they were as they were feminine and had a long staff with a sickle at the end of it. Running towards the girls, he managed to hear the end of their conversation. Well, let's hope that he can open up to us about his past a bit more when he gets back from this. 𝗵𝗃's voice rang out, before it fizzled out of existence. Director-san. Skeletal warriors and a shadow servant are here. Izuku called out as the two immediately got into fight or flight mode. Mash immediately rushed around to help 𝗬𝗏 as Izuku stayed near Olga as the woman appeared to be nearing a panic attack from the number of times they were attacked in one day. Izuku helped her move across the increasing danger of the battlefield, and with Mashu and 𝗬𝗏 moving about the place protecting them from one of the shadow servants, they came across the archer servant who was looking at them with a very crude expression on his face. He wasn't glaring at them, just staring at them with curiosity at best. What is your end goal of this singularity? He asked as Izuku looked at him. Who are you talking to? Izuku asked as Archer jumped down from his elevated position. I'm talking to the emissary of Chaldea. He said, pointing his weapon at the boy in question. What do you mean by that? Olga asked as the man glared at her. I wasn't asking you, woman. I was asking the emissary of Chaldea. The archer stated, pointing his blade at Izuku. We're trying to save humanity. It gets incinerated in the future. Izuku said as the archer thought about his own answer. If you were to win the Holy Grail, what is your wish? He asked again, this time in a more solemn tone. I don't care about a wish granting device. Besides, I have no dreams anymore. Izuku said, looking down. You wouldn't be a MSTR if you didn't have at least one dream, kid. I know the look you are trying to keep hidden beneath your skin. You wish to be a hero, don't you? Archer questioned. Does it matter? I can't be one anyway. Izuku said before looking at Archer. Whoever said that you cannot become a hero is full of SHT. Anyone can become a hero if they put their mind, heart and soul into their motivation to become a hero. Now tell me, if you were to win the Holy Grail, what kind of wish would you make? Archer asked. I'd give the wish to someone else. They'd need it far more than I ever would. Izuku said, as Archer watched him closely. There was no more words being said between the two, and surprisingly Archer lowered his weapon. And he began to walk away, as his body began to disappear into motes of golden light, but he looked over his shoulder to tell the Chaldea survivors a warning. If you wish to enter MT Enzo and get the Holy Grail, you better know that you will need to fight like hell. Because Saber is there protecting it with her life. She killed her previous emissary just to be capable of using it. Archer said, disappearing fully. Saber is guarding the Holy Grail. Well, we're downright Olga said, before slapping a hand over her eyes with a groan. Surely we can beat her, right? Izuku asked, looking at Olga. Right. Izuku asked as the woman glared at him. We're so dead, we're going to die and it will be all your fault. Olga growled under her breath, causing Izuku to look at her funny. What are you looking at me like that for? She asked. Well, I didn't want to ruin your moment, but Mash and 𝗬𝗂 have returned. Izuku said, as the woman looked over her shoulder to see Mash standing there with a confused expression. Although 𝗬𝗂 was giving her a disapproving expression as they traveled across the bridge. Izuku had done a small head count on the whole shadow servants that had attacked them. It was Lancer, Archer, Rider and Assassin that only left Saber, Caster who was with them but not a Shadow, and Berserker. Izuku looked around the area, before glancing over at 𝗬𝗂 who was looking around the area as well before noticing Izuku's eyes on him. Is there something you need to know, 𝗵𝗃? 𝗬𝗂 asked, as Izuku blushed crimson. Please don't call me that. I feel embarrassed for someone as cool as why you call 𝗵𝗃. Izuku said, embarrassedly. Don't worry about that, kid. It'll grow on you, just you wait and see. But anyway, I think I know where we'll find Berserker. Caster said, as they arrived at a tunnel leading into 𝗵𝗃. Please tell me that Berserker isn't inside here. Izuku asked, looking at Mash and 𝗬𝗂. Well, I can't say that he's in there, but at the same time I can't say that he isn't in there. 𝗬𝗂 said as Izuku slumped. Well, not time like the present to see if we can actually have some good luck. Izuku mumbled before they entered the cave. Not too far away, a very tall and buff individual stared at the small squad entering the tunnel. He growled ominously as he stepped towards the tunnel, his feet slamming into the ground with terrifying cracks as his muscles contracted, creating a very disturbing sound of RBB being ground up. As the group headed down the deep dark tunnel, Izuku was beginning to think things through. Everything in his life was apparently leading up to this very moment within this singularity, something he still had no idea what in the hell he was doing but was just going with the flow. His mother always told him that he was adaptive to whatever situation she'd ever given him growing up. He just hoped that his adaptive abilities could assist him in this event at the moment. Well, because there was a literal demon from hell chasing them down through this god-forsaken tunnel. Graia. Heracles' shadow servant form called out from behind. How in the world did we not see him? He's freaking huge. Izuku screamed as he, Olga and Mash comedically ran down the tunnel with Caster not too far behind them. Maybe he had the chance to hide his presence. Olga questioned whilst running. But from what you say that's impossible since he's a berserker class enemy. Izuku screamed out, as he dodged a kanabo flung in his direction. I didn't want to fight Berserker right now. Caster yelled as he created a rune to protect them from Berserker for the moment. Why is he so focused on me right now? Izuku whined as they ran through the tunnel. Hey, you brought this upon yourself. You came into the room to save Mashu. Olga called out as Izuku gave her a flat look. What was I supposed to do there? There was fire everywhere, and she was in pain. Izuku screamed out in panic. The group had continued to run through the tunnels, taking multiple entryways into other tunnels leading Berserker down a different path each time. And as they continued to run in fear of the Berserker, they heard him begin to break down the tunnel they were rushing through, but his incessant growling and roars were soon gone from their ears. Apparently, Berserker hit a massive amount of rock and rubble and caused the tunnel to collapse and block his way to them. At least they hoped that was what exactly happened since he didn't show up at any more forks in the road. Okay, we need to calm down. 𝗬𝗂 called out as he caught up with the others. I can't breathe. Izuku muttered out as his panic soared higher. Mash moved closer to Izuku as she rubbed the boy's back as he continuously tried to calm down his raging heart. 𝗬𝗂 moved over as well as he used some rune to increase Izuku's calmness of mind and body as he slowly began to slump towards the ground before he took a knee and placed a hand over his head. Once that was done, Izuku sat down on the ground before looking at the opposing wall as he checked the time that was given to them via a technological watch connected to Chaldea. Looking at the time, he was horrified with what the time was over there. It hadn't even been 5 hours since they'd arrived here, and all this chaos had happened. Tea time is confusing. Izuku muttered as Olga glared at him. What was with you screaming back there? Olga asked, angrily. I'm sorry if IW was worried about G getting away from a L literal servant who could K kill us without a S second thought. Izuku barked back. But that doesn't mean that you can run faster than me. What in the hell got into you to run faster than me? I thought you didn't work out. Olga yelled at him. I'm just very well practiced. Izuku said, looking away with a blush. Sure, practiced. Olga grumbled before looking at the ground. They all remained quiet as they gathered their strength and magical energy. Izuku though was getting antsy as he pulled out the notebook from earlier as his hands twitched and trembled with each and every motion. He'd moved his hand in order to grab at it. As he held it close to his ear, he felt himself relax slightly as he opened it up and turned to a new page, randomly manifesting a pen into his hand, greatly confusing his peers who were watching him do this. The boy began to record their experience in the notebook as though he were going to copy it later on, and he was breathing heavily as he did this before he closed the notebook and placed it back where he'd gotten it originally. That was until he noticed everyone's vision all placed on him. What? Izuku asked, confused. How do you manifest things that you didn't even bring with you? Olga asked as Izuku just stared at her. Oh, are you talking about the pen? Izuku asked as Olga nodded. I had that on me the entire tea time. Izuku said, as Olga just stared at him in disbelief. What's next you going to say you brought lunch with you? CU questioned with a mirth in his eyes. Actually I did. Izuku said, somehow pulling multiple bentos from his back pocket. The others just stared at him as though he were the creator of a dimensional pocket that had just manifested itself as his main ability. Are you sure that you're not a servant? Mashu asked, concerned. Why I'm sure. I can't use a magic like CCU and I'm not nearly as strong as 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏. Not as smart as most people though. Izuku said, looking away. I'm just average. Izuku said, rubbing his finger in the ground in a circular motion. Alright, you all fix your problems with one another. I'll keep watch on the tunnel system. CU said, stretching his body after eating some food. I don't have a problem with everyone. Izuku said indignantly. Yeah, you might not have a problem with the others, but they might have a problem with you. CU said, bluntly as Izuku looked at the two girls. One looked at him with sympathy and sadness, whilst the other was looking away in clear embarrassment from being found out. Izuku sighed and pulled his knees up to his ear. If they had the time for a break, they had the time to talk this problem out of existence. The more people who stopped caring about his well-being, the more normal things could get in his opinion. And as he waited for the two women to speak, he watched as Mashu spoke up first, since Olga was clearly going to wait until they've said their piece. Senpai, can you tell me why you don't like talking about your past? Mashu asked, as Izuku glanced at her. Izuku remained as quiet as possible, mainly because he was surprised by her question and how blunt it was. Although, he really wanted to gather his thoughts in order to answer her question in the best way possible without making it appear as though he wanted to be helped by her, he didn't want to burden her with his past. In his eyes, he wasn't as important as everyone else present in the tunnel at this particular moment in time. My life hasn't been the best. But I'm sure that others are having a far worse time than I did. I would just rather forget about it, keep it out of mind. Izuku stated as Mashu stared into his eyes. She knew he wasn't telling the full truth, but she really hoped that he would eventually inform her about this past life before Chaldea soon. It would eat at him for the longest time before it would explode, and nobody was wishing to be around for when he would eventually snap from all the pressure as well as criticism from everyone. That was when Mashu nodded, and Olga spoke up. Midoriya, don't think that I'm being too touchy here. But the whole reason that you were grabbed of the street was because we were one emissary short at Chaldea. If our last emissary who was on the list wasn't sick and could come in, you would have been continuing on with your life. But the only thing I have against you is the fact that you are a complete anomaly to magecraft as a whole. You have magic circuits, but you never use them. Surely you could have noticed them in the past. Olga questioned as Izuku glanced at her now. I never knew I even had magic circuits. I only found out when I went to that meeting at Chaldea, before the explosion took most of the MMSDRs out. Izuku said, rubbing his left arm. So you're telling me that you had a father who was a mage and he never told you about his magic circuits? Olga asked as Izuku looked at her funny. My father never told me about his life outside of our family. He only told me that he works in the United States, and even then he hasn't really talked to me and my Izuku said, feeling self-conscious about telling them about his life. So your father hid his life in the States from you and your mother. Has he even told you if he even gotten himself a new family? Olga asked, looking at the worst-case scenario. Like to not to think about that. He never told us what his life was like in the States. Izuku said, looking uncomfortable. After stating those words, the trio had just stayed quiet for a while with nobody wanting to continue the conversation at all. One could only hope that they could reveal some things that could give one another something to build off of in order to try and make a bridge between their conflicting personalities. That was until Izuku spoke. My life ever since I was announced 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 it's just been utter hell. Izuku muttered. Nothing more needed to be stated, all that said was reason enough for one of the women to stare at him in sympathy. Although one of them was for completely different reasons for the other, as 𝗵𝘃𝗄 stared at Izuku in sympathy for being incapable of controlling whatever he was born with. Olga however stared at him in utter pity. She was born into a household that had incredible amounts of power, and the fact he was born into a family that was basically null compared to the rest of the world's population as well as mages in general, she wished he could have been born within her family. At least then he'd have far more confidence. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏. After a while of silence between the trio, Izuku let out a sigh before he stood up stretching his limbs. 𝗵𝘃𝗄 did the same as Olga sat still thinking about what happened between the three of them, all as 𝗬𝗪 was making his way back over to them where he could see them. He saw the looks on their faces. Izuku was grimmer than the girls, but the women were far more determined than the boy himself was. If anything, he looked far more uncomfortable than he'd been before. He let out a sigh of exasperation before he made sure to keep them on the task at hand, just to keep them distracted from whatever they had talked about, not that he didn't hear any of it. The group continued down the tunnel that they had been walking through until they reached an open area within it. It was massive in terms of height alone. It wasn't something that you'd find in any kind of mountain unless you went as deep as you could inside of it into your own demise. But that wasn't the problem right now. The problem was the fact that 𝗬𝗧𝗪 was standing right in front of everyone as he glared at each and every person with a hatred that Izuku couldn't guess. 𝗬𝗪 also couldn't place the hatred in 𝗬𝗪𝗪's eyes as the beast walked over to them with a glare of his own extending to that of Izuku. By the time he stood across from the small group of four, he glared at each and every person with a silent assessment of their character. Looking between each one, he found each one to have their own merits, but by the time he'd gotten to Izuku, the boy was staring at him with nothing more than fear alone. But that fear was overshadowing something that 𝗬𝗪𝗪 could see that really wanted to be let out, the urge to help him from whatever problem he had. 𝗬𝗪𝗪 moved slowly towards the group, 𝗵𝘃𝗄 entering a combat stance, but looking confused when he passed right by her. Each of them was greatly surprised to see 𝗬𝗪𝗪 kneeling in front of Izuku. Not in a way where he would be giving his allegiance to the boy, no, he knelt down as he began to pat the boy's head with nothing more than a grunt coming out of his mouth that was surprising for them all to see. Heracles, the Greek legend to have taken on multiple from the gods of Greece themselves, was kneeling to pat Izuku on the head as if that would calm down the boy's raging heart. That was all before the Greek legend pointed them in the direction they needed to go. How they knew that it was the correct way to go, you may ask. Well, the fact he kept grunting at them whilst pointing in that direction, of course. So as they moved in the direction, he pointed at Izuku, stared at 𝗬𝗪𝗪 with a curious glint in his eyes. He moved back to 𝗬𝗪𝗪, who had been looking at the boy with a curious glint in his eyes as well. Even though they were enemies beforehand, the 𝗬𝗪𝗪 was holding himself back from attacking them again. Izuku held a hand out to 𝗬𝗪𝗪 as the man looked at the extended hand as the boy looked into 𝗬𝗪𝗪's red eyes. "Thank you for helping us move in the right direction," Izuku said, as 𝗬𝗪𝗪 moved his hand out. And in an act of camaraderie, they shook hands before 𝗬𝗪𝗪 flinched slightly and grabbed at his head. All before practically launching himself out of the cave they were in, forcing Izuku to run to catch up with the others as they moved through the tunnel again. And as they ran into the dark depths of the tunnel, we see 𝗬𝗪𝗪 launching himself as far into the sky as possible and essentially sending himself right into space. That way he will take way too long to return back to the battlefield. because Heracles may have been an agent of the gods, but he listened to no man, especially one who titled themselves as a demonic god. With Izuku and the others, they had been trying to wrap their heads around the fact that 𝗬𝗃𝗃 showed a different side of himself towards Izuku. Olga and Mashu were very worried about Izuku's well-being. But that could be sorted somewhere else when they weren't running straight into a battlefield, as when they arrived within another cave, they found the Holy Grail floating in the air as it seemingly glowed ominously. As they moved to collect the Grail, that was when someone new showed up, and it wasn't another kind face. To think that 𝗬𝗃𝗃 could deny his MSDR's wishes. He was an utter fool. If he cannot defeat you all and end your journey here, then I will take it upon myself as the King of Knights to rid you all. The person called out, revealing Artoria but with a different look. The woman who had once had blue and silver armor and blonde hair now had a lighter-colored version of her blonde. Her eyes were golden in color, and her armor was black and red, the red being outlined across her body as though her mind and body weren't entirely there. Not to mention how the black seemingly seeped into her neck, causing her to look far more feral than most other servants, and Olga growled to herself in fury. Of course, the Holy Grail was being guarded by Saber, and of course, Saber had been completely taken over by madness enhancement, but not enough to take away her coherence. Okay, we really need to talk about the luck we've been getting as of late. Olga yelled as Izuku stared at Saber. Her eyes belied that nothing behind them were her original self, but if anything this appeared to be a far different Saber. One who didn't care about her actions and dealt with the consequences on the go. This was Saber, but altered this wouldn't be a good fight for them at all. See you, do you have something that could defeat Saber as fast as possible? Izuku asked, concerned. I mean, if I had a command seal powering me up I could use my noble phantasm, but that requires me to have the time and magical energy to use. 𝗬𝗑 said as he pulled out his staff. Then use all the magical energy you can glean from me, and when I use the command seal, that is when you use your noble phantasm, all right? Izuku said, looking at 𝗬𝗑, what are you and the other two going to be doing? 𝗬𝗑 asked as Izuku shrugged. We'll keep her off of you. Izuku said as 𝗬𝗑 sighed. Just stay out of danger, she'll be gunning for you, 𝗬𝗑 said with a teasing remark at the end. If you all are done strategizing right in front of me, then I will take the fight to you. Saber called out, rushing towards Izuku. If you will not come to me, then I will come to you. Saber called out as she rushed towards Izuku. The young man didn't allow her to land an attack on him as he leaped out of the way just in time as she slammed her sword into the ground. Izuku had leaped with Mash in his arms as they tumbled across the ground due to the blast radius of Saber's slam onto the ground. As the woman turned to look at Izuku with an expression ready for battle, he got right into his role as Emser and forgot about his whole grabbing onto Mash in order to get out of the way of an attack. Mash, you go at her from the front, we need to keep her distracted. Izuku called out, as Mash nodded and rushed the Saber. Yes, senpai. She called out, swinging her shield at Saber, who blocked the attack effortlessly. Izuku glanced over at Olga, who was looking at him with confusion before she noticed his gaze on her. Director-san, I need you to use whatever spells you can use at your disposal. Izuku said to her as Mash and Saber clashed once more. Who gave you the right to tell me what to do? She called out, angrily but following his directions. I need you to just not argue with me on this. Just use your magic to keep Saber on her toes. We cannot allow her to get close to 𝗬𝗑, Izuku replied as he leaped out of the way from another slicing attack from Saber. Running around the cave, Izuku had dodged energy slices even though he thought he shouldn't have been capable of reacting to something like that. But he didn't take a gift horse in the face in how he was capable of that and decided to not worry about it at all, considering from what Saber looked like, she wasn't even trying at all against them. And as she leaped over at him, he had no chance of dodging out of the way of this next slicing attack as she appeared in front of him and rose her sword to slice in a downward horizontal strike. But just as Izuku was about to lean over to his left, Mash came in and blocked the strike and kicked Saber back, causing her to skid on her feet. And as she got her bearings back with a battle-ready smirk on her face, some gander shots smashed right into her back. She glanced over at Olga as the woman shrieked and went to move to a different angle to blast the Saber servant from afar, but was rushed by Saber, who was subsequently followed by Mash. Moving back over with 𝗬𝗑, Izuku watched as the servant had managed to get a quarter of his runes all set up for his noble phantasm, and everything was slowly moving right according to his plan. All that needed to happen was them tiring out Saber just enough to where she wouldn't be able to react to Seiyu's noble phantasm in time. But she then turned her attention to how Izuku was basically a sitting duck and immediately rushed him once again. Instinctively, Izuku raised an arm up into the air to block the attack, and everyone present were wearing faces of shock as the young man was being sliced with a very fatal attack from Saber. She wasn't playing around as she went to move her sword at him straight for his 𝗧𝗧 that he'd thrown his arms up to stop as though they could catch the very blade. But something odd happened. His arms glowed an ominous purple color as a giant shield projection had appeared to block the attack. It didn't block the entire attack, as it sent Izuku tumbling backwards as he smacked a nearby rock on his head, but it blocked him from being pierced. "Since when could you do that?" Olga screamed as she rushed over at Izuku. Mash had rushed over to Izuku's side as well as she checked up on him. And this gave Saber all the time she needed to catch her breath slightly before rushing at the women with their backs turned to her, a very rookie thing to do for both of them as Izuku's vision supplied him with Saber leaping at the two from behind. Standing upright immediately, Izuku pushed the two women out of the way, causing Saber to stare at him in surprise as the young man had taken the slice on his 𝗧𝗧, causing him to be blasted back from her power alone. Slamming into the wall behind himself, Izuku let out a cry of pain that was quickly muted by him biting 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝙢𝙢 on his hand. Looking at the uniform he'd been wearing, it had taken most of the attack that Saber had thrown at him and was basically turned to ribbons as it revealed his upper torso except for his arms. He wasn't thinking straight as he pulled himself out of the wall, as he ignored the sound of blood dripping from his very clear gash wound on his 𝗧𝗧 as he moved over to Mash and Olga, who were staring at him in clear confusion. "We need to move," he called out, dragging the two out of the way. "What the F what?" Olga cried out, as Mash got up and ran with Izuku. Saber watched the trio move to the other side of the cave with her back to Seiyu. She knew what he was trying to do, and she was allowing them this little farce, although she could feel Seiyu's glare centered on her back as she stood upright before looking over at Izuku intently. Seeing the boy's upper torso, she had been witness to seeing what amounted to years' worth of scars that could be only accrued through a tortuous lifestyle where he had to have been abused on a daily basis. Walking over, she stopped a few feet away as Izuku's body trembled in front of her. She could see he was clearly scared of her considering how his pupils have long since dilated. "Young man, what life have you lived to appear this way?" Saber asked, looking into his now shocked eyes. Izuku asked as Saber looked at him intently before walking closer. Mash immediately blocked her way to him as she felt a hand on her shoulder as Saber lifted her into the air and threw her over at Seiyu. The man barely could react as he was focused on the spell he was planning on using on Saber to end this whole thing right from the start. As Mash's voice rang out in pain, Izuku glared at Saber as the woman now stood above him, her height making him appear as though he were nothing more than a toddler walking around the park. "I will only say this again once. What life did you live to appear like this?" she asked, pointing at the obvious scarring around his torso aside from the gash wound on his 𝗧𝗧 from her. Why should I tell you?" Izuku questioned, very suspicious. "I only wish to know, because in my lifetime no child was harmed when under my rule," she stated as Izuku peered into her golden-colored eyes. "Life that was nothing compared to yours," Izuku said as Saber thought about her next words carefully. "Surely you jest. Tell me now, before I kill the woman next to you," Saber said, as Izuku glanced at the weapon pointed at Olga's neck. He remained silent as he watched Olga have a fearful expression as she nodded at him to tell the servant. He looked over at Mash and Seiyu as the two were looking at him in clear worry, and Mash was rushing over as fast as she could to try and attack Saber. Where superpowers were the normal. Where someone W without power was treated as though we were less than trash itself. I was a second-class citizen in the eyes of others. A mere test subject for others to get stronger," Izuku said, before shuddering his last words out. "A punching bag." Saber stayed quiet, her eyes no longer being seen as her hair blocked his view of it. He glanced over at Olga as the woman stared at him in shock but schooled her features since they would most definitely be talking about this later, if they do survive this moment in time. 𝗵𝘃 had stopped moving as she heard him practically scream these words out, causing her to immediately think about all his actions from before in Chaldea. The way he seemed especially scared of every single person within Chaldea, especially those who were very uncaring for their words about him when he was both around and not. Did anything bad happen to you before entering Chaldea? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 questioned, sword trembling slightly. I asked my idol if my dream could be attained. Izuku said as 𝗧𝗵𝗲 shuddered slightly. He denied your dreams, didn't he? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 questioned but worded it as more of a statement. I have no power at least not of my own. He told me to be realistic, and to not pursue my dreams. Izuku said, before gaining a far more panicked expression looking at 𝗬𝗑. The man had finally finished his spell and was preparing to launch it over at 𝗧𝗵𝗲, and the servant herself was appearing as though she were preparing for it. So in a bid that confused him, Olga and 𝗵𝘃, she grabbed Izuku and Olga and tossed them over at 𝗵𝘃 as the young 𝗎𝗪𝙀 pseudo-servant had caught them in a panic. She rose her sword in the air as it glowed an ominous red and black color before 𝗵𝘃 stood in front of the duo with her shield blocking the way as a small holographic shield arose from the ground. Just as 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was about to unleash her attack on the trio in order to end their lives, she hears the sounds of chanting. My magecraft is a cage of flames, a flaming but verdant giant. Retribution. A shrine that purifies the evil of human affairs. 𝗬𝗑 spoke, before rushing near Izuku, 𝗵𝘃 and Olga and foe having manifested himself in the area. I'm proud you've held out for this long, even if it may not have been too long itself, he said, before rushing in front of the shield itself and raising his staff in the air shocking 𝗧𝗵𝗲. The one who destroys Wicker Man. He called out, stomping his staff on the ground. As soon as 𝗬𝗑 said those final words, a magic circle appeared underneath 𝗧𝗵𝗲 who looked intrigued with the spell casted. All before a giant made of wood and metal appeared from the ground lifting her from it, and as the woman fell from its head and was caught in its hand. She tried to escape from its grip before it used its other hand to open up its 𝗧𝗧 and her inside closing the metallic gate behind her as it started to heat up. And as the giant head fell down towards the ground, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was seen falling down with it as she slammed into the metallic gate as the entire area was blocked by the magical flames from 𝗬𝗑's spell. A massive gust of wind pushed past everyone as 𝗵𝘃 and Olga grunted, with Izuku managing to catch foe as it was tossed into the air. And pulling the animal to his 𝗬𝗧, he felt it start to lick at his still bleeding wound, before focusing his eyes on the attack in front of them all. The gusts of wind continued to blast past them all as 𝗬𝗑 watched the flames with a very cautious expression bordering on serious. The Wicker Man had then stood up encompassed by the flames as it broke through the cave that the fight was originally taking place inside, creating a giant pillar of flames to represent how much damage was done to the area. As soon as the smoke and debris soon cleared up, it revealed a very badly burned and defeated 𝗧𝗵𝗲, whose armor was slowly falling apart, but at the same time she herself was slowly disappearing from the world. She could only chuckle at the strength of this group of people before speaking to them. It's already over, the Grand Order has already begun, she said as 𝗬𝗑 glared at her. What are you talking about? What is this Grand Order? 𝗬𝗑 called out. I won't say, but just know this is just the beginning for you all, she said, before she turned into gold motes of light. Izuku mulled over her words as he noticed something happening to 𝗬𝗑 as well. The man was slowly disappearing in blue motes of light, and the man soon noticed it before he clicked his teeth in clear distaste for this kind of end. Ding, it appears that I'm dying as well. Well, it was fun whilst it lasted, but I guess I'll see you all later. 𝗬𝗑 questioned as Izuku stared at the man in shock. But before he could even get words out, 𝗬𝗑 had disappeared from sight. Izuku felt himself feel a bit bad for having 𝗬𝗑 use all of his magic as well as a command seal in order to seal the deal in taking down 𝗧𝗵𝗲, no pun intended. But as this was happening, they found that the Holy Grail for the 𝗧𝗑𝗪 singularity was just floating in the air where 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had once been, and running towards it Izuku felt something was off. Olga took note of Izuku's hesitance of moving towards the Holy Grail when they heard clapping coming from a nearby area, and looking over they found a man standing there, his eyes closed whilst a smile was shown on his face. Good job on taking care of Saber. I never thought you'd be capable of taking her on without a power of your own, but things just never stop entertaining me. The man said, as Izuku's expression became far more reserved and cautious with him. Leviticus. What are you doing here? I thought you were in the explosion back at Chaldea. Olga called out, relieved. Well, director, you know me. I'm able to escape from any problem I see. The man, Lev stated with a very cruel smirk on his face. Thank goodness, we can now head back with the Holy Grail and begin to end these singularities. Olga stated, walking towards the man. Director-san. Izuku called out, placing a hand on her shoulder. What? She asked, completely confused as to why his face was showing vast amounts of concern. Don't trust him, Izuku said, with a very fearful expression on his face. Why shouldn't I trust him? He's the one who's been by my side through all of this. Olga said, as Izuku shook his head. He's not trustworthy. I don't know why, but I don't feel like he is someone you can trust. Izuku said, as Olga pulled her arm from Izuku's grip. I don't care what you say, Midoriya. I trust him with my life. Olga said, walking up to the man before giving him a hug. The man said nothing. But he gave Izuku a very sinister smile as he rose a hand and grabbed Olga by the shoulder. She looked up at the man with confusion before he used displacement magic on her, causing her to lose her gravity in the cave. Izuku went to rush over at the two before Mash grabbed him and held him still. Senpai, don't get any closer. It's too dangerous. Mash said, recognizing Lev as a major threat. Director-san. Izuku called out, reaching out to the woman as Mash held on to him. You know, Olga, I have to say you were a very vindictive but very bitchy boss. And I am so glad that I get to have this moment with you. Lev said as Olga stared at him in fear. Why are you doing this? I thought you worked with my father to complete this mission of his. She called out, as Lev smirked evilly with his eyes being revealed to be a rainbow of colors but sinister. That is why I killed him. He was too dangerous to be left alive. After all, I was the one who created this singularity in the first place. Lev said, before chuckling maniacally. Leave the director alone. Izuku screamed as Lev looked at him. And you, the so-called final emissary of Chaldea. My boss wanted to have you ignored, but I can see your threat level. If you are to stay alive, then you will be a thorn in our sides. So by causing this death, I will place you on a path towards joining us. After all, we both want humanity's destruction. Lev said before showing them Chaldea's. Izuku watched as Olga was lifted into the air and she was brought to Chaldea's core. Izuku struggled to break free from Mash's grip in order to stop this from happening, and as he struggled unaware to anyone watching this event, his arms began to glow a green color. Tiny, minuscule sparks of green electricity arced around his body as he somehow managed to form a bow for him to use, garnering the attention of Lev, who had looked over at him. His cruel smirk was increasing as Olga was brought over to Chaldea's through a portal and was nearing the core of it all, whose power was on par with that of a black hole itself. What's this? He questioned as Mash noticed Izuku having escaped from her grip. With a furious expression on his face, Izuku pulled the string on the bow as a green arrow with sparks of electricity had begun to spark all around his body as tears flowed from his eyes. All as he let out a massive scream of fury. Give her back! Izuku yelled as he released the arrow towards Leviticus. The man leaped away from his position as the arrow angles and flew towards Olga, just barely managing to grab her as she began to scream in pain. Just from her body touching Chaldea's was causing her to scream in ungodly amounts of agony before an arrow grabbed her clothing and yanked her away from Chaldea's immediately. But the damage was already too much before her body fell towards Izuku and Mash, the latter of which managed to catch her and look over her injuries as Izuku pulled back on his string again. And as soon as he released it with as much power as possible, Lev watched as the arrow flew towards him at an even higher speed than before, and it stopped right in front of his arm that rose up in defense. Just as he was about to gloat about how it was too weak, it began to twist in the air like a spiral before piercing through his arm, causing him to be greatly confused. All before detonating and leaving the area in a massive smoke cloud.